To understand what happened here, you need to know three people. The first is a man I'm going to call Thomas. Thomas was born in this town in 1951. Grew up on Elm Street, 2 blocks from the church. His father worked at the mill, his mother taught 4th grade. He was the kind of kid who fixed his neighbor's fences without being asked, who everyone assumed would just stay forever, settle down, raise kids of his own. He did stay. And for most of his life he was content. He became a local official, a records clerk, which doesn't sound important until you realize that a records clerk is the person who knows exactly where everything is filed and exactly when something goes missing. Thomas noticed something missing in 1987. It took him 12 years to understand what that missing thing meant. And another 3 years after that before he told anyone. The second person is a woman named Linda. Linda wasn't from here. She moved to town in 2001 with her husband and 2 daughters, drawn by the low property prices and the reputation for good schools. She was a freelance journalist, the kind who wrote about local government, planning disputes, water quality. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that should have put her in anyone's crosshairs. Within 18 months of arriving, she had filed 3 public records requests that were denied. She had been told, politely but firmly, by 2 separate officials that certain historical documents were unavailable for review. She had also started receiving phone calls, always late at night, always silent, that stopped the moment she picked up. Linda told me that at first she assumed she was imagining a pattern that wasn't there. That she was looking for a story because that's what journalists do. Then she found Thomas. The third person isn't a name I can give you. Because they're still living here. Still going to that diner on Main Street, still nodding hello at the church on Sunday. Still sitting on information that could answer the one question this whole story keeps circling back to. They agreed to speak on condition that their identity be protected completely. What they told me, what they had seen firsthand before they understood what they were seeing, is the reason this video exists. I'm going to tell you everything they told me. But first, you need to understand what was already there. What had been buried long before any of these 3 people were old enough to ask questions. Because this secret didn't start with them. It started decades earlier. With a decision that was made behind closed doors, by people who believed they would never have to answer for it. They were almost right. The history of this town goes back further than most people know. And to understand the secret, we have to go back to the beginning. In the spring of 1999, Thomas was doing what he had done every working day for 11 years. Cataloging incoming records, filing outgoing requests, maintaining the archive that formed the institutional memory of this town. It was routine. Deliberately, carefully routine. And then he opened a drawer he had opened 100 times before, and found that something was missing. Not dramatically missing. Not ripped out. Just absent. A property transfer file that should have been there, according to the index, that had been there as recently as 18 months before, according to the internal log, simply gone. Thomas told me, I thought I'd made a mistake. I went back through the log 3 times. I checked the adjacent folders. I assumed it had been misfiled. That's usually what happens. He submitted an internal query. Standard procedure. He expected to receive the misfiled document within a week. He never received a response. Now, to understand why that missing file matters, you need to understand what it contained. The file documented the transfer of a 17-acre parcel of land on the eastern edge of town. The same stretch of road that isn't on any current map. The same land connected to that 1974 ordinance restricting public gatherings. The transfer had taken place in 1961. And the name of the buyer had been redacted, not in the original document, but in the copy that had been filed in the public archive. Someone had deliberately obscured who owned that land. Thomas spent 2 years trying to find the original. He made requests through proper channels. He was told the document had been lost in a water damage incident in 1978. An incident that, when he looked for the maintenance records, had also apparently never been logged. A missing file. A missing original. A missing maintenance record. 3 absences, each one perfectly explainable on its own. For 12 years, Thomas sat on what he knew. Raised his family. Went to work. Went to church. Said good morning to the same people who had, in some cases, watched him make those records requests and said nothing. He told me, I knew what I knew. But knowing something and being willing to carry the consequences of saying it out loud, those are 2 completely different things. And then, in 2011, someone else started pulling on the same thread. We are now going back further than Thomas, further than Linda, further than anyone who is still alive to remember. Because to understand what's been hidden, you have to understand what it was built on top of. This town was incorporated in 1903. Before that, it was a mill settlement, owned in its entirety by a single family whose name appears on the original county charter, on the deed to the church, on the cornerstone of the building that became the first town hall. For the first 40 years that family didn't just live here. They were here. They were the employment, the infrastructure, the law. In the late 1940s, as the post-war economy shifted and the mill became less profitable, that family began to divest. Slowly at first, small land parcels sold to incoming residents, some factory assets transferred to a holding company based 2 counties over. By 1955, the family's visible presence in town had almost entirely receded. The name still appeared on the church dedication plaque, on a war memorial, on 2 street signs. But the land? The land they had divested? Most of it had never actually left their control. This is what Linda found, not through official records because those had been carefully managed, but through a source she described to me as the thing that bureaucracies always forget to redact: old insurance maps. Insurance maps, for those who don't know, are extraordinarily detailed property surveys conducted by private companies throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. They were created for fire risk assessment. They document who owns what the buildings are made of, what sits on adjacent land. And they were archived by private companies, not local governments. They cannot be quietly removed from a county archive, because they were never in a county archive. Linda found a 1948 insurance map for this town at a university library 40 miles away. She sat with it for 3 hours, cross-referencing it against current county records. And she found 17 parcels of land, including those 17 acres on the eastern edge of town, where the recorded ownership in the county system did not match the private insurance record from 1948. Land that should have belonged to one entity in the public record appeared to belong to another in the private one. Some of those parcels had changed hands multiple times in the intervening decades. But when Linda traced the chain of ownership forward through shell companies, holding trusts, and subsidiary organizations, the beneficial owner in every case traced back to the same family name, the family that had supposedly left. But land ownership, however deliberately concealed, is not in itself the secret. It's the context. It's the infrastructure of control that made everything else possible. What happened on that land, what that control was used for, is something no insurance map could tell Linda. For that, she needed a person. She needed someone who had been there. She needed Thomas. When Linda and Thomas finally compared what they each knew, in a parking lot 2 towns over, because neither of them felt safe meeting locally, the picture that emerged was worse than either of them had separately imagined. And it centered on a single year, 1969. In 1969, 4 residents of this town were reported missing within a period of 7 months. For people. 7 months. One town of fewer than 4,000. The first was a 23-year-old schoolteacher named Margaret. She had grown up here, left for college, and returned 2 years earlier to take a teaching position at the elementary school. Her colleagues described her as sharp, principled, and unusually curious about local history. She had been, in her spare time, researching the town's founding for a project she hoped to eventually publish. She was last seen on a Tuesday evening in February. Her car was found parked outside the local library, which had been closed that day. The investigating officer's report, which Linda obtained, notes that there were no signs of struggle, no suspicious activity reported by neighbors, and no identified persons of interest. The case was closed as a voluntary departure. She had, according to the official record, simply chosen to leave, within 43 days of her disappearance. 43 days. No body. No confirmed sighting. No verified contact with family. The second was a man named Earl, 41, who worked as a surveyor for the county. Earl had, in the months before his disappearance, been conducting a routine land survey in the eastern part of town. He had filed 2 interim reports, both of which raised questions about boundary discrepancies in the area around those 17 acres. Earl told his wife 2 weeks before he disappeared that he had been asked by his supervisor to hold the survey and not file his findings until further notice. Earl's wife said that he came home that evening and said, "Something is wrong with that land and I'm not supposed to say so." Earl vanished 6 days later. His survey findings were never officially filed. The third was a 19-year-old named Clara. The fourth was a 57-year-old retired mill worker named Hector who had been vocally critical at town meetings of a proposed development project in the Eastern District. All 4 cases were investigated by the same officer. All 4 were closed within 60 days. None of them were connected in any official document. No task force, no combined investigation, no acknowledgement that 4 disappearances in 7 months in a town this size was statistically extraordinary. Because to connect them would have required asking what connected them. The families of Margaret, Earl, Clara, and Hector never stopped looking. Some of them are gone now themselves. But their children, and in some cases their grandchildren, have continued to push for answers through every formal and informal channel available to them. They were told, consistently and over decades, that there was nothing more to find. They were wrong. There was more. There was significantly more. And by 2012, Linda had found enough of it to understand that what happened in 1969 was not an isolated year of tragedy. It was a warning shot. Because between 1969 and the present day, at least 11 other individuals had been systematically discredited, professionally destroyed, or driven out of this town for one reason and one reason only: they had gotten too close to the same question. And the mechanism that silenced them was still, as of the date of this investigation, completely intact. The concealment of what happened in this town was not the work of one powerful person operating alone. That is the version that is easy to understand: a villain, a conspiracy, a smoking gun. That is not what this was. What this was is harder to look at, and far more common than we want to admit. It was a structure. Built over decades, maintained by the ordinary operation of institutions, and held in place by something much more mundane than malice. It was held in place by convenience. The planning committee, the records office, the local police, the county surveyor's office, and the editorial board of the local newspaper all had, at various points between 1960 and 2005, at least one member who was employed, directly or indirectly, by entities connected to the family discussed earlier. Not all of them. Not even most of them. Just enough. Enough to ensure that certain requests were delayed until they became moot. Enough to ensure that certain investigations were assigned to certain officers. Enough to ensure that certain stories were spiked before they ran, or ran buried on page 12 with a headline that described a dispute over property boundaries rather than a pattern of disappearances. Nobody had to issue orders. Nobody had to threaten anyone. The system simply had a gravitational pull, and the people inside it learned over time which direction not to lean. Linda described it as institutional weather. She said, "It's not that someone tells you it's going to rain. It's that you've lived in this place long enough to know what certain clouds mean. And you carry an umbrella without anyone having to ask you to. For people who didn't carry the umbrella, who asked the wrong question, filed the wrong request, published the wrong thing, the consequences were specific and consistent. A professional complaint filed against a journalist with their licensing board, citing ethical violations that were never substantiated but required 18 months to formally dismiss. A surveyor's contract not renewed. A teacher denied tenure for reasons described in vague language about cultural fit. A records clerk passed over for promotion year after year, with no explanation given. Individually, each of these things is entirely explainable. Together, they form a pattern so precise it could only be deliberate. By the time Linda understood the full shape of the mechanism, she also understood something else. Understanding it and doing something about it were completely different problems. Because the mechanism didn't just suppress information. It also created an alternative narrative that was solid enough to survive casual scrutiny. A narrative that framed the missing people as troubled individuals who had chosen to leave, the missing documents as bureaucratic casualties of a water-damaged archive, the land questions as a minor historical discrepancy that had long since been resolved. To challenge that narrative in any official forum, you needed something the narrative couldn't absorb. You needed a witness. Linda had documents. Thomas had institutional knowledge. But neither of them had been there, inside the mechanism, watching it operate in real time. The third person in this story had. And in 2013, after years of silence, they finally agreed to talk. By 2013, Linda had been investigating this story for 2 years. In that time, 3 formal complaints had been filed against her with the State Press Council, all dismissed, but each one requiring time, legal counsel, and emotional energy that she described as a deliberate drain. Her access to county records had been restricted on a technicality that her lawyer was contesting. A local property developer, one she had never written about, had filed a defamation suit against a piece she had published about an entirely different subject, which her editor described to her as the kind of litigation whose purpose is the process, not the outcome. What kept her going, she said, was 2 things. The first was Earl's wife. The second was a package that arrived at her home address, an address that was not publicly listed, in October 2013. Inside was a USB drive. On the USB drive were 17 photographs and a handwritten note that read in its entirety, "You're looking in the right place. There is more. I can't give you my name yet. But I will. Wait." Linda took the USB drive to a digital forensic specialist who confirmed the photographs were authentic and undoctored. They showed, in chronological order across a span of roughly 40 years, meetings between a senior county official, a representative of the holding company that controlled the eastern land parcels, and a law enforcement supervisor, all in locations that suggested deliberate privacy. A private dining room. A boat moored at a marina 2 towns over. A back office of a business that had since closed. These were not public meetings. These were not coincidental encounters. These were coordination. Thomas, when Linda showed him the photographs, identified 3 of the individuals immediately, officials he had worked alongside for years. Officials who had, on multiple occasions, handled or been adjacent to the very records requests he had made and never had answered. The anonymous source, the third person whose name I cannot give you, made contact again in early 2014. This time they agreed to meet. In person. In a location they chose, that Linda was not permitted to disclose in any notes or communications until the source gave explicit permission. What they told Linda in that meeting was the piece that the documents, the photographs, and the insurance maps had not been able to provide. The testimony of someone who had been inside the room. What the source described, what they had witnessed directly in real time without fully understanding what they were seeing until years later, finally gave Linda and Thomas the answer to the question that had started all of this. What had happened on that land in 1969? And why 4 people had disappeared asking about it? In the spring of 2014, Linda published the first piece. Not the full story, she didn't have everything yet, and her editor had advised a measured approach, releasing what was provable before moving to what was probable. The piece focused on the land records discrepancy, the insurance maps, and the documented pattern of denied records requests. It named the holding company. It did not name individuals. Within 72 hours of publication, 3 things happened. First, the county records office issued a statement acknowledging for the first time that certain documents from the period in question were unaccounted for, and announcing an internal review. Second, Linda received a letter from a law firm she had never heard of, representing a client it declined to name, threatening legal action for defamation in relation to the holding company reference, despite the fact that the holding company had not been named as responsible for anything, only as a party to land transfers. A company that hadn't been accused of anything had nonetheless immediately retained lawyers to defend itself. Third, Thomas received a visit at his home from a man he described as professional, soft-spoken, and carrying no identification. The man told Thomas that he understood Thomas had been speaking to a journalist. He told Thomas that the county valued his long service. He told Thomas that it would be a shame if certain historical irregularities in the records office were attributed to mismanagement that could be traced to his tenure. He was, in other words, telling Thomas that if he continued to cooperate, he would be made responsible for the very cover-up he had tried to expose. Thomas called Linda that evening. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "I'm done being careful. Tell the whole story. Tell it now. I'll put my name on everything." The second piece ran 3 weeks later. It included the photographs. It included Thomas's sworn account of the missing property file and the subsequent absence of any response to his internal query. It included the testimony of Earl's wife, with her explicit, enthusiastic permission. It included a timeline connecting the 4 1969 disappearances to the land survey that Earl had been conducting at the time. It included, for the first time, the names of 3 of the individuals visible in the photographs, all of whom were either currently serving or had recently retired from public positions in the county. The response was immediate and it was not subtle. Linda's publication had its advertising contracts canceled by 3 local businesses within a week. 2 of her colleagues resigned under circumstances she described as pressured. Her editor was summoned to a meeting with the publication's board of directors, a meeting whose contents she was not informed of, and after which the editorial stance on the investigation became, in her word, cautious. Thomas was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review of his records management practices, a review that had no specified completion date. The anonymous source went completely silent. For 3 months, it appeared as though the mechanism had done what it always did, absorbed the challenge, neutralized the threat, and resumed its ordinary function. But something had changed that couldn't be unchanged. The story was out, and some of the people reading it had their own pieces to add. In the months following the publication, Linda received 47 unsolicited contacts from current and former residents. People who had seen things, remembered things, or had been sitting on documents of their own for years. The investigation had cracked something open, and what came out of it would make the original story look like only the beginning. Of the 47 people who contacted Linda after the publication, 23 eventually agreed to provide formal statements. Of those, 9 were willing to be identified by name. Their accounts, taken together, extended the pattern of institutional concealment backward to the early 1950s and forward to as recently as 2009. They described specific incidents. A local council vote on a development proposal that several members later said they felt coerced into. A criminal complaint filed against a resident that multiple witnesses believed was fabricated. A public health report that was altered before submission to the state authority. 47 people. Across 60 years. All describing variations of the same thing. In late 2015, the State Attorney General's office opened a preliminary inquiry, not a full investigation but an inquiry, into the land ownership records and the conduct of the County Records Office. The inquiry ran for 22 months and ultimately produced a report that acknowledged significant administrative irregularities and recommended improved record-keeping procedures. It did not name individuals. It did not result in charges. It did not address the 1969 disappearances. Thomas was reinstated after 14 months on administrative leave. His internal review found no evidence of mismanagement. He retired 6 months later at 63, having spent his last year of employment being escorted to and from his office by a colleague at the request of his union representative, because the soft-spoken man with no identification had paid him a second visit. Linda left the town in 2016. She still writes, not locally and still waiting for the thing that would make the whole picture complete. She is waiting for someone to explain what was on that land. Not who owned it. Not who protected it. Not which officials coordinated to ensure it stayed protected. What was on that 17 acres that was worth destroying 4 people to protect? The official account says the land is currently under environmental review by the county. It has been under environmental review for 9 years. There are no public records of any findings from that review. The 1974 ordinance restricting public gatherings near the land is still on the books. And the families of Margaret, Earl, Clara and Hector are still waiting. The town looks the same. The church is still there. The diner still has its chalkboard. The football team still plays on Friday nights in the fall. The people who live there, most of them, are decent, ordinary, warm. They did not choose to live inside a secret. Some of them don't know, even now, the full shape of what their town has been carrying. But some of them do. And there is one detail, one specific, documented, inexplicable detail, that none of the official responses, the internal reviews, the Attorney General's inquiry, or the environmental assessment has ever addressed. It is the detail that the anonymous source, in their most recent communication to Linda, described as the thing they will never explain away, because they can't. In the summer of 2017, 3 years after Linda's investigation went public, a retired environmental consultant named Dr. Renata Voss published a technical paper in a regional geology journal. The paper was not about this town. It was about groundwater contamination patterns in post-industrial rural communities across the state. Buried in the appendix, in the kind of dense technical language that ensures most people will never read it, was a single paragraph referencing a site identified only by its county grid coordinates. Those coordinates correspond exactly to the 17 acres on the eastern edge of town. Dr. Voss's paper noted an anomalous subsurface chemical signature at that location, one consistent with the long-term burial of industrial waste materials. The signature, she wrote, suggested the site had been used for disposal purposes for an extended period, possibly beginning as early as the mid-1950s. She flagged it as warranting further investigation by the relevant county authority. The relevant county authority is the same body that has been conducting an environmental review of that land for 9 years without producing a single public finding. After the paper was published, she received a phone call from an attorney representing an unnamed client, informing her that the grid reference in her appendix had been identified in error and that any further reference to that specific site should be removed from future publications. She is a retired academic with no financial stake and no professional vulnerability. She declined. The secret was never only about land ownership. The land was used, for decades, for something that produced a chemical signature Dr. Voss, with 30 years of environmental consultancy behind her, could not identify. And the 4 people who disappeared in 1969 were not random. Earl was a surveyor. He had been on that land. He had filed reports that were suppressed. The anonymous source, the person who sent Linda the USB drive in 2013, who met with her in 2014, who has remained in this town for their entire life, sent a final communication in March of this year. It was 3 sentences. They dug at night. More than once. The last time was 2009. I was there. I have read that message more times than I can count. None of them were surprised. All of them were afraid. What happened here is not an anomaly. The mechanism we have described, the gradual institutional suppression of inconvenient knowledge through a combination of selective record management, professional pressure, strategic legal interference, and the ordinary human preference for not knowing things that would require action, is not unique to this place. It is not unique to this era. It is a pattern. And it recurs wherever the conditions are right: concentrated private interest, institutions with overlapping personnel, a community small enough that social pressure can substitute for legal coercion. What is unusual about this town is not that it happened. It is that 3 people refused to let it stay hidden. Most of the time, the mechanism holds. Most of the time, the 47 people who could come forward don't. Most of the time, the official record remains the only record. I think about that often. I think about all the versions of this story that no one is making a video about, because no Thomas, no Linda, no unnamed witness ever broke cover. Because the missing file stayed missing. Because the families were told there was nothing to find, and eventually, exhausted, they stopped looking. That is not a failure of courage. That is what sustained institutional pressure is designed to produce. What this investigation also reveals, and I want to be precise here, is the specific vulnerability of communities where institutional memory is concentrated in few hands. Where one family, one employer, one network of connected officials can shape what is known and what is not. It is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It is something more ordinary and therefore more difficult to see from the inside. It is a town that learned over generations what questions not to ask. The church still stands at the center of town. The diner still has its chalkboard. The football team still plays on Friday nights. The people who live here, most of them, go about their lives with the uncomplicated ease of people who believe the place they live in is what it appears to be. Some of them are right. Some of them are not. Margaret has never been found. Neither has Earl. Neither has Clara or Hector. Their cases remain officially closed, voluntary departures, all 4 of them from a town they had lived in their entire lives, in a 7-month window that the official record treats as coincidence. Earl's wife is still alive. She still leaves the porch light on. Thomas is retired. He lives 2 states away now. Linda is still writing. She will not let go of. Not because she thinks she can finish it, but because she believes that every time it is told, the chances increase that the person who can finish it will hear it and decide the time has finally come. The 17 acres are still there. The 1974 ordinance is still on the books. The environmental review is still, technically, ongoing. Dr. Voss's paper is still in the journal archive, appendix intact, grid coordinates unredacted. And somewhere in this town, a person whose name I am not permitted to share is living their ordinary life, going to the diner, probably, nodding at the church on Sunday, carrying in their memory the answer to the question that this entire investigation has been circling. The town is still standing. The secret is still mostly intact. And the people who tried to pull it into the light paid a price that most of us will never be asked to pay. That matters. Not because it changes the outcome, but because the only reason any of us know any of this is because 3 people decided that the cost of staying silent had finally become higher than the cost of speaking. Remember their names: Thomas, Linda, and someone driving past a porch light that still burns. What was buried on those 17 acres between the mid-1950s and 2009? Dr. Voss found a chemical signature she could not identify. The anonymous source was present at a night excavation as recently as 2009. 4 people disappeared in 1969, one of whom had been specifically surveying that land. No official body has ever answered this question. The County Environmental Review has been ongoing for 9 years with 0 published findings. This thread is open. It may remain open. But it is there, and it is documented. I'm going to ask you one final question. And I mean it as a genuine question, not as a prompt, not as engagement bait. Just, what do you think is on that land? You have heard everything I have heard. You have followed the same trail. Based on all of it, the chemical signature, the night excavations, the 4 people who disappeared asking about it, the 50-year pattern of institutional protection. What do you believe?